Dominic Marre hadn't looked up from the photograph in 30 seconds. The blood seeping from the man on the floor had reached the edge of the Persian rug, and he still hadn't looked up. The photograph was grainy, taken on a cheap burner phone in bad light. Penny Callum was zip-tied to a folding chair in what looked like a cold storage unit. Her dark hair loose around her face, her cheek already beginning to swell. She was looking directly at the camera, not crying, not begging, looking at it like she was memorizing the face behind the lens. That was the thing about Penny. She was always watching, always cataloguing. It was what made her dangerous to him, and he hadn't understood that until right now, staring at a grainy photo of her in enemy hands, feeling something in his chest come completely unhitched. Dominic set the phone face down on the desk. He looked at his underboss, Fen. How long ago? 40 minutes, Rowan was with her. He took 2 to the shoulder before they put him down. He's alive. He called it in from the curb. 40 minutes. Dominic did the math quietly, the way he did everything, without expression, without waste. 40 minutes was enough time to move her across state lines. It was also enough time for Strickler to make his demands, which meant Strickler wanted to talk before he did anything permanent. That was the only thing keeping Dominic's hands steady right now. He stood up from behind the desk, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the window overlooking the river. Detroit was gray and flat beneath an October sky, the kind of sky that looked like it had given up. He had not given up. He was, in fact, just getting started. He needed to go back 3 years to explain Penny Callum, because Penny Callum was not supposed to matter. The arrangement had been purely transactional. The Marre family, what remained of it after Dominic's father bled out on a loading dock in 2019, had clawed its way back to relevance in the Midwest distribution networks. But the old money, the Sicilian Commission out of Philadelphia, wouldn't formally recognize Dominic's control over the Great Lakes corridor without what they called continuity of household. A married man, a stable man, a man with something to lose. Dominic had plenty to lose. He simply hadn't planned to let anyone see it. He needed a wife the way a corporation needs a registered agent. Someone whose name appeared on the paperwork, who showed up at the right functions, who made the right impression, and who otherwise stayed out of the way. What he hadn't wanted was a mob princess who understood the game and would play it against him. What he hadn't wanted was a socialite who would crumble the first time she saw what his life actually looked like. He needed invisible. He needed transactional. He needed someone with a reason to keep their mouth shut and no reason to cause trouble. He found Penny Callum through a debt. She was 26 years old, 5'4", and somewhere in the neighborhood of 270 pounds. Something she carried with a complete lack of apology that Dominic had not expected and didn't know what to do with. She worked as a hotel housekeeper at the Renaissance downtown, the kind of job that required showing up at 5 in the morning and smiling at strangers who didn't see you. She had a GD and a community college certificate in bookkeeping, and she had been sending money home to her mother in Flint every single month for 4 years without fail. Her younger sister Greta had borrowed $30,000 from a loan shark with indirect connections to Dominic's operation. Greta was 22, impulsive, and had believed someone when they told her a bar was a good investment. The bar had failed. The debt had not. Dominic bought the debt on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, Penny appeared in his office. She hadn't been told the full extent of who she was meeting. She'd been told a name, an address, and that someone wanted to discuss Greta's situation. She walked in wearing her good coat, wool, navy, slightly worn at the elbows, and sized up the room in about 4 seconds flat. Her eyes moved over the security at the door, the desk, the window, the man behind the desk, and then back to the door, like she was filing exits. "You bought my sister's debt," she said. "Not a question. Sit down, Miss Callum. I'd rather stand until I know what this is." Dominic had looked at her for a long moment, then he slid the folder across the desk. She read the contract standing up, one hand resting on the back of the chair she'd declined to use. She read the whole thing. He timed her. 7 minutes, 40 seconds, including going back to reread 2 clauses. 3 years, she said finally. 3 years. I attend functions. I live in your house. I don't ask questions about the business. She looked up, and Greta's debt disappears. Entirely. And you walk away with $150,000 in clean funds when the term concludes. Penny Callum looked at him. He had expected calculation, maybe fear, maybe the particular kind of miserable resignation he'd seen on the faces of people who had run out of options. Instead, he got something that looked almost like the beginning of a decision. You understand that I need 48 hours, she said. He had not been expecting that either. For what? To make arrangements. My mother has a medical situation. I need to make sure she's covered before I'm relocated. She set the folder back on the desk with both hands flat on top of it. I also need it in writing that my employment record is clean. I'm not walking away from 3 years of someone else's life with a gap I can't explain. Dominic studied her. Agreed. Then I'll be back Thursday. She came back Thursday. She signed the contract without ceremony, folded her copy into her purse and said, "Where do I sleep?" The first 4 months were nothing. They moved in parallel through his house in Grosse Pointe, like 2 planets in separate orbits. Polite, contained, careful not to crash. Dominic had a schedule that put him out of the house by 6 most mornings and rarely returned him before 9 at night. Penny filled the space he left. She was quiet in a way that wasn't nervous. It was the quiet of someone who had spent years being unremarkable by design, who had learned that being noticed in the wrong places cost more than it was worth. He noticed her anyway. It started with the staff. His housekeeper, Teruella, had worked for the Marre family for 11 years. She was 63, deeply private, and had never in Dominic's memory laughed in the kitchen. He walked through one November evening and heard laughter, actual laughter, and stopped in the hallway to listen to Penny asking Teruella whether she thought bay leaves actually did anything, or if everyone was just pretending. It was such a specific, unnecessary question, so precisely the kind of question someone asked when they genuinely wanted to know the answer, not when they were trying to make an impression. He walked away and told himself it was irrelevant. Then there was the morning in December when he came down early, earlier than his usual time, and found Penny in the kitchen in her robe at 4:30 making bread, not from a recipe on her phone, from memory, her hands working the dough with the kind of unconscious muscle memory that meant she'd done it 1,000 times. "I didn't think anyone would be up," she said, not looking at him, not apologizing. The kitchen was sitting there empty. He poured his own coffee. Teruella hadn't arrived yet, and sat at the island and watched her work. She had her hair loose, dark and thick, and flour on her left forearm where she'd pushed the sleeve up. She wasn't performing anything. She wasn't aware of him in the particular self-conscious way that most people were aware of him. She was just making bread at 4:30 in the morning, because the kitchen was sitting there empty. He stayed for 20 minutes. He didn't say much. Neither did she. He left when his phone buzzed with the first of the morning's problems. The bread was on the counter when he got home that night, still wrapped in a kitchen towel. There was a sticky note on it that said, "Bay leaves do nothing." I stand by this. Dominic read the note twice. He didn't throw it away. He told himself he was going to throw it away and kept not doing it. The shift, when it came sideways. The Michigan Commerce Foundation held its winter gala every February at a hotel in Troy. It was one of the functions where Dominic's name appeared on the donor rolls next to politicians and hospital administrators and old manufacturing money. One of the nights when the legitimate face of the Marre enterprise had to be polished to a high shine and pointed in the right direction. Penny had attended 2 previous events without incident. She was good at them in a way he hadn't anticipated. Steady, composed, never reaching too hard for conversation, never performing in the hollow way of women who'd been trained for rooms like this. That night, she wore deep burgundy, a wrap dress that moved with her when she walked. She had done something different with her hair. She looked, he thought, exactly like what she wasn't, like someone who had always belonged in rooms like this. They were standing near the bar during the cocktail hour when he heard it. A man he recognized, Harwick Selby, second-generation money, the kind of person who thought his inheritance excused his mouth, was holding court with two other men near the ice sculpture. He was not speaking quietly. "That Marre. I heard he married his cleaning lady. Saw them at the Beaumont thing back in September." A pause, the particular pause of a man delaying the punchline. "Well, not exactly cleaning lady material anymore, is she? More like the couch she's got to fit through the door." The two men with Selby laughed. One of them stopped laughing very quickly because he'd seen Dominic's face change. Penny had heard it. Dominic knew she'd heard it because he was watching her, had been watching her without entirely meaning to, and he saw the exact moment the words landed. A small stillness. Her eyes went down to her glass. Her chin dropped just slightly, the particular angle of someone absorbing a familiar blow. She started to shift her weight, a small retreat, automatic. Dominic moved before he made a decision to move. He crossed the 4 feet between them and put his hand on the small of her back, not gently, not for the cameras. It was acclaiming, complete and total. He walked her directly toward Selby. The man had the sense to go pale. Harwick. Dominic's voice was so quiet it barely carried past the two of them. "My wife just heard what you said. Dom, I didn't, that was just. Look at her." A pause. "Apologize to her." "Not to me." Selby looked at Penny. His face had gone from pale to the particular grey of a man standing on the edge of a cliff. "Mrs. Marre, I apologize. I'm sorry." Penny looked at him. She held it for 3 full seconds, which was, in Dominic's experience, an extremely long time to hold a look under those circumstances. Then she said, "Thank you," in a tone that gave him nothing, and turned toward the room. Dominic didn't touch Selby. Not in that room, with those witnesses, with the gala photographers moving through the crowd. He didn't have to. Selby knew, everyone in earshot knew, what the absence of physical consequence from Dominic Marre actually cost. He would collect it later, quietly, at his own convenience. In the car home, Penny sat on her side of the back seat, with her face turned toward the window. Dominic could see the reflection of the highway lights moving over her in the glass, the particular stillness of someone trying not to show that something had gotten through. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I disagree. People say things. It's not." She stopped. Started again. "I've heard worse. I know you have." He looked at the back of her head. "That's not a reason to hear it again." A long silence. The highway moved. She didn't turn around. "Dominic, what? Why did it bother you?" It wasn't quite a question. It was something harder than a question. The careful laying down of something she wasn't sure she wanted answered. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the glass, at her reflection, at the city lights moving over the side of her face. "Because it was wrong," he said, "and because you're mine, and no one disrespects what's mine." He meant it in every possible way when he said it, including the one he hadn't been planning on. She turned from the window then and looked at him directly. He looked back. The distance between them in the back seat was very small, and had been getting smaller for months without either of them saying so. He reached out and touched her face, his thumb at the edge of her jaw, his fingers barely at her cheekbone, and felt her breathe. He kissed her. It wasn't for the gala, wasn't for the commission, wasn't for anyone watching. There was no one watching. It was just Dominic Marre making a decision he hadn't made slowly enough. Kissing a woman he'd told himself for 4 months was just furniture. Penny kissed him back. That was the thing he would come back to, afterward. She kissed him back like she'd also been waiting to make the same decision, and simply hadn't wanted to be the one to make it first. By March, the separate bedrooms had stopped being a fact. By April, he knew he was in trouble. Harlan Creed had been waiting for an opening for 7 months. He ran the East Side Trade Networks out of a warehouse complex in Sterling Heights, a tightened, efficient operation that had been slowly hemorrhaging territory to the Marre family's expanding distribution corridors for the better part of 2 years. Creed was not a patient man by nature. He was a grudge holder, a scorekeeper, a man who framed the world in terms of what he was owed. He had watched Dominic Marre through every available channel. He'd looked for the mistress, the habit, the financial irregularity, the crack in the armor that would give him purchase. What his people brought back had seemed, at first, like a joke. Marre was, and there was no other word for it, devoted. Not in the way powerful men were devoted to young, beautiful women they dressed and displayed and eventually discarded. The way he watched his wife move through a room. The way he rerouted his own schedule when she had doctor's appointments. The way his men described the expression on his face when she walked into a room he was already in. Creed's informant had put it plainly. He lights up. Marre lights up like a guy who can't believe his luck. Harlan Creed had laughed out loud when he heard that. Then he'd started planning. Penny's Tuesday routine had not changed in 6 months. The Eastern Market, the farmer's market in the Gratiot Avenue sheds, open year-round. She went every Tuesday morning 7 to 9 with one security escort named Rowan Hess. She'd specifically asked for one escort. She'd told Dominic that a woman walking through a farmer's market with 4 armed men in earpieces was conspicuous and weird, and he'd agreed to one while quietly stationing a second man in civilian clothes 70 feet back. It almost wasn't enough. It was a Tuesday in early October, a cold, clear morning that smelled like apple cider and cut chrysanthemums. Penny was at the cheese stand. She had her canvas bags over her arm, and she was having a serious conversation with the vendor about whether the smoked Gouda was actually smoked or just flavored, a distinction she had opinions about. Rowan was 6 feet behind her, watching the shed entrance. He never saw the 2 men come in through the loading bay at the back. It happened in 12 seconds. A commotion near the entrance, a dropped crate, a noise, something designed to pull the eye. Rowan turned. The 2 men from the loading bay moved fast and quiet, and Penny didn't have time to do more than start to shout before something chemical and dark slammed the world sideways. Rowan was down 30 seconds later, a taser and 2 men sitting on him before the civilian clothes backup was even in position. He had a broken wrist and a head injury before the van cleared the shed. Dominic was in a meeting with his attorney when his phone rang on the private line. He excused himself from the room. Marre. Harlan Creed's voice was the voice of a man who had been waiting a long time to make this call. Beautiful morning out here. Your wife seems less happy about it than I am. Every muscle in Dominic's body turned to concrete. Creed, I'm going to need you to listen carefully because I'm only going to say this once. You're going to sign over the Great Lakes routing to me. Full corridor, no conditions. 24 hours. If I don't have your signature on paper by tomorrow morning, I start making decisions about your wife that you won't enjoy hearing about. A pause. She's fine right now, for what it's worth. Crying a little, but fine. It's actually kind of Creed. Dominic's voice had dropped to something that barely moved the air. Listen to me very carefully. If you harm her, if you make her afraid, if she has so much as a bruised wrist when I find her, and I will find her, and I will find her tonight, I will not simply kill you. I will take apart everything you have built, everyone you have bought, everyone who has ever worked for you or owed you or feared you, and I will make sure that 20 years from now no one can even find your name on a piece of paper. The silence on the line was its own kind of answer. 24 hours, Marre. Clock's already running. The line died. Dominic stood in the hallway outside his attorney's conference room and looked at the wall for 4 seconds. Then he walked back into the conference room, told his attorney to reschedule everything for the rest of the week, and called Fenn. Find her. he said, already working on it. Rowan's call came in 20 minutes ago. He's at Detroit receiving, he's stable. He got a partial plate and a direction. Creed's holding her. Find me a location in the next 2 hours, and then... Dominic buttoned his jacket. And then we go get her. Penny had been awake for 30 minutes when she began taking inventory. Her head hurt. Her mouth tasted like copper. She was in a folding chair in the center of what looked like a cold storage facility. The walls were industrial steel panel. The floor was sealed concrete, and the temperature was low enough that her breath was visible. Her wrists were secured behind her with a cable tie through the chair's rear legs. There were 3 men in the room. 2 were positioned near the entry door. 1, the man she'd identified as in charge, a lean, angular man with expensive shoes and cheap eyes, was standing in front of her, looking at her with the particular expression of a man who expected his enemies to be impressive and was revising his assessment. "I thought Dominic Marre would have better taste," she said. He said it conversationally, like a man who thought he was being witty. "Word is he's completely gone for you. I have to say, looking at you, how many men does it take you to feel safe in a room with a zip-tied woman?" Penny asked. He blinked. "I'm just curious," she said. 3 seems like a lot. His face changed. She'd seen that change before. She'd spent years in service jobs, years navigating men who expected her to flinch and recalibrated badly when she didn't. She watched him decide to stop being witty, and she kept her breathing even and her eyes on his, and felt her wrists against the back of the chair, and took very careful note of the angle. "You should be scared," he said. "I've been cold and uncomfortable before." She let her gaze move very deliberately around the room. Camera in the corner, distance to the door. 2 men, one with a shoulder holster that sat too high, compensating for how he'd been trained, probably, or how he hadn't been. "You took me to make Dominic negotiate. That tells me you're not planning to do anything permanent. Which means I have time. Time for what? To wait for him to come get me." She looked back at the man with the expensive shoes. "He's coming, I know him. He's already coming. The question is what shape you want to be in when he gets here." The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, short, dismissive, and walked away, back toward the far wall, pulling out a phone. Penny looked down at her wrists. The cable tie was a single-use industrial type, looped through the lower rear support of the chair. Because the chair back was a full width. Because the engineer who designed folding chairs had not been planning for this exact use case. And because Penny's wrists were set wide by the breadth of her shoulders and the thickness of her forearms, the loop was not as tight as it should have been. She began working it, quietly, with patience she had been building her whole life. When the power in the facility went out, all at once, no flicker, a hard cut, she was ready. She heard the entry team before she saw anything. There was a sound like the world ending, a percussion blast through the exterior wall that shook the floor, and then a rush of cold air and white flashlight beams and the sharp, flat sound of men who knew what they were doing, moving through a space fast and without noise. Penny had already kicked the chair sideways and thrown her full weight against the cable tie. The tie snapped. Her knees hit the concrete. The guard closest to her, the one with the holster that sat too high, turned toward her in the dark and didn't see her low until she drove her shoulder into his knees with everything she had. 270 pounds of terrified, furious woman hitting him at the exact wrong angle, and he went down sideways, his head hitting the edge of a steel shelf on the way to the floor. She crawled toward the wall. The flashlights swept. Men were shouting in the particular controlled, purposeful way of people executing a plan. Then the main lights came back on. Someone had restored the secondary power, and Penny was pressed against the base of the steel wall with her back to the cold metal, and Dominic Marre was standing 20 feet away. He had blood on his shirt, not his, she registered, from the controlled economy of his movement, not his. He was scanning the room, efficient and total, and then his eyes found her, and the scan stopped. He crossed the floor in 8 steps. He dropped to one knee in front of her, and she watched him, watched the wall come down, watched every calculated wall she'd ever seen on his face simply cease to exist, replaced by something she didn't have a word for, except the closest word was relief, and it was vast. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough. Not the voice he used in the office, not the voice he used at galas. Something underneath all of that. "My wrists, and I hit the floor hard. I'm okay." She looked at him. He was still scanning her, hands hovering. She recognized this. He was afraid to touch her, afraid of hurting something. She reached out and took both his hands and pulled them toward her, pressing his palms flat against her face. "I'm okay, Dominic. I got the ties off." He closed his eyes. She felt him exhale, a slow, structural thing like a building releasing pressure it had been holding too long. "You got the ties off," he repeated. "The chair back was the wrong width for the tie. I noticed it early." She paused. "Also, I knocked one of his guys down with a shoulder tackle." He opened his eyes and looked at her. Something shifted in his face. "He went into a shelf," she said. A longer pause. "Are you telling me you tackled a man? He had a weapon, and he was turning toward me. I didn't have options." Dominic looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he pulled her forward against him, wrapping his arms around her with the particular care of someone holding something breakable. Which she wasn't, and he knew she wasn't, but she let him hold her like that anyway, because she understood what he was doing. He was finishing the exhale he'd started when she'd taken his hands. His face was in her hair. "You are the most. I know. I wasn't finished." "You were going to say something embarrassing." "I was going to say," he said into her hair, "that you are the most extraordinary person I have ever been stupid enough to underestimate." She pressed her forehead against his shoulder and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say. His arms tightened once, very slightly, and then stayed. Harlan Creed, she would later learn, did not make it out of the facility under his own power. She did not ask for specifics, and Dominic did not provide them. They were home by midnight. The family doctor had come and gone. Her wrists were abraded, not broken, and she had a bruise along her left hip from the floor that was spectacular in its range of colors. She was sitting in the center of their bed in one of his shirts, her hands wrapped, a cup of tea going cold on the nightstand, when Dominic came out of the bathroom in the gray sweatpants and old Detroit Red Wings t-shirt he wore when he wasn't performing anything for anyone. He was carrying a folder. She watched him sit on the edge of the bed. He opened the folder and she saw the contract. Her contract, 3 years, Greta's debt, the $150,000. She recognized it by the particular weight of the paper. She had read it so many times she knew its shape. He opened the junk drawer in the nightstand and took out a lighter, flicked it open, touched it to the corner of the paper. The flame caught. He held it over the bedside ashtray, and they both watched it burn. "Dominic! What are you doing?" "Renegotiating." He set the burning folder in the ashtray and let it go, watched the last corner curl and blacken. "The contract is done. Greta's clear." "That's been done for 8 months. I just hadn't told you because you hadn't asked. The money is in an account in your name." "That's not what I'm talking about." She looked at the ash, then at him. "The arrangement is over," he said. "You can leave. I will make sure you and your mother and Greta are covered completely. You have my word, and you know what my word is worth. Dominic, I need you to hear the option before you answer." He turned to face her fully. His voice was deliberate, the way it was when something mattered enough to say slowly. "You can go. With everything. New life, new city, whatever you want. I will give it to you, and I will be grateful for the time I got." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the 4:30 mornings in the kitchen, and the note about bay leaves, and the way he'd crossed a room in front of witnesses to put his hand on her back. She thought about the way he'd dropped to his knees on a concrete floor in a cold storage facility and been terrified to touch her. "What if I don't want to leave?" she said. His chest moved. "What if I want the renegotiated terms instead?" she said. He reached out and took her hand carefully around the bandaging. "Then the renegotiated terms are no end date, no exit clause, no contract. You are not furniture, and you are not a cover story, and you are not anything that can be rented." His thumb moved over her knuckles. "You are my wife, actually. If you'll have that." Penny Callum, Penny Marre, she supposed, if she was choosing, looked at the man sitting on the edge of the bed in his old Red Wings shirt, holding her hand like it was something worth holding. "I'll have that," she said, "but I want it in writing." He looked at her. Then, slowly, something broke open in his face. Not a smile exactly, more like the architecture of the not-quite smile she'd been learning for 3 years, the one that meant he was actually, genuinely undone. "In writing," he repeated. "I read contracts carefully. You know this about me. I do know this about you." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips against her knuckles above the bandaging. "I'll have something drafted. With a bay leaf clause, absolutely not. Acknowledging that bay leaves are decorative and serve no culinary function. Penny, think about it." He was still holding her hand. Outside the window, the Detroit River was dark and flat, and the lights of Windsor were small and cold across the water, and Dominic Marre, the most feared man in 3 states, was sitting in his old T-shirt arguing about bay leaves with the woman who had walked into his office in a worn wool coat 3 years ago and refused to sit down until she knew what she was dealing with. 8 months later, the annual Commerce Foundation Gala was held at the Shinola Hotel. The room hushed as Dominic Marre walked in, the way rooms always hushed for Dominic Marre, but the eyes went, as they always did now, to the woman on his arm. Penny wore deep gold, a gown that moved over her curves, with the particular ease of something designed for a body exactly like hers. Her hair was loose. She was 6 months along and carrying it with the same unbothered, unhurried dignity with which she carried everything. She walked into the room the way a woman walks into a room when she has already decided it belongs to her, and she smiled at Dominic's underboss, Fen, and she waved at Terila, who was seated near the entrance with her husband, and she looked around the room with the clear, steady eyes of a woman who had read the contract and negotiated the terms and decided to stay. No one made a joke, no one had made a joke in some time. They looked at her, full and luminous and certain, and they looked at the man beside her, and they understood something that didn't need to be said. Harlan Creed had thought Penny Callum was a liability. He had thought she was the soft place in the armor, the weak point, the angle of approach. He had been the last person to make that mistake, and it had cost him everything. The woman on Dominic Marre's arm was not soft in the way that could be exploited. She was soft in the way that water is soft. She moved around every obstacle. She found the shape of every container, and she wore down stone by simply continuing to be there, steady and certain and very much herself. Dominic Marre had spent his whole life building walls. She had simply waited until he stopped being embarrassed about having a door.